The sun spilled to the courthouse's tall arched windows in shafts of dusty gold, catching in the polished oak of the benches and the brass trim on the double doors. But the light did nothing to warm the air, which hummed with an electric kind of tension, like a theater just before the curtain rose. Commander Maya Ellis sat at the defense table, but no one called her that. The court docket called her the accused, a black woman who was accused of resisting arrest, obstruction, and assaulting a peace officer. Her dark hair was neatly bunged, her navy blazer was tailored but unassuming, and her posture, the straight-back stillness of someone who knew what stillness could command, attracted the attention of anyone who looked at her for more than a second. Behind her eyes, something sharper that had been trained for years to watch, measure, and wait for its moment was moving. She didn't fidget, shift in her seat, or show even the tiniest outward sign of nerves. Across the aisle at the prosecution's table, Officer Brad Nolan lounged with a kind of cocky ease that came from knowing the room was, at least at first glance, on his side. He was tall, white, and in his early 40s. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and on his chest were a slew of medals that shone in the bright lights. He murmured something occasionally to the other uniformed officers seated in the front row, causing them to laugh and smirk at Maya, as if they were trying to shrink someone without touching them. Linda Pierce, the prosecutor, was already going through a neat stack of exhibits, including edited body cam footage, arrest reports, and photographs, with the intention of portraying Maya as yet another non-compliant civilian who had made poor Officer Nolan do what was necessary for his own safety. The gallery was full of civilians curious about the case they had seen teased on the morning news, as well as a few law students in cheap suits scribbling for their trial observation credits. The majority of eyes shifted between the assertive officer and the composed woman in the blazer, with the assumption skewed toward the uniformed man out of habit or bias. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur. All rise. With her robes flowing, Judge Caroline Hughes entered the room, her gaze spreading across the space like a spotlight that saw more than it said. Everyone sat when she did, and the air seemed to settle into a tighter coil. The clerk read, the syllables echoing against the wood-paneled walls. State of Maryland versus Maya Ellis. Nolan whispered to his colleague, not quite quietly enough, but she won't have much to say for herself, as the initial formalities concluded. His lip curled in disdain as he glanced at Maya. Maya heard it and everything else. She kept her eyes forward, her breathing even, remembering every drill, every long night on missions where the wrong twitch could cost lives. Despite the different stakes, the battlefield felt familiar here. Nolan was already halfway up when the judge asked the prosecution to present its first witness. He was twirling the front of his uniform with a tug that was almost theatrical as he did so. He made his way to the witness stand, swore, and leaned forward as if the microphone were a spotlight just for him. His voice was confident, his cadence rehearsed, the practiced authority of someone who had testified dozens of times before. He began, I conducted a traffic stop on the defendant's vehicle for failure to signal a lane change on the evening of April 14th. Upon approach, the defendant displayed an aggressive demeanor, refused to produce her driver's license, and made multiple threatening gestures toward myself and my partner. His words flowed effortlessly, each detail carefully chosen to provoke and justify. She resisted legal orders, requiring me to use physical restraint to protect myself and others. I said. He didn't look at Maya when he spoke of her. He looked at the jury, at the judge, at the crowd, seating the image he wanted them to hold, a dangerous, belligerent woman who had brought the trouble on herself. The prosecutor gave him a nod and continued to support his version of events by gently asking him questions. Alex Grant, Maya's attorney, scribbled notes at the defense table and occasionally glanced up at his client. But Maya didn't look up. Instead, she was focused on Nolan, her face unreadable, and she was replaying the entire scene, every second of it. In her mind, her voice was calm. Her hands were visible on the steering wheel. Her ID was passed over without hesitation, his condescending tone when he saw her name, the unnecessary order to step out of the car. She recalled the sting of her palms against the hood, the cuffs that were too tight, his mocking, "Commander of what, your book club?" when she identified herself as Commander Ellis. At the time, she had retracted her response, allowing him to believe what he wanted. She hadn't needed to prove anything that night. But today was different. The truth today had a schedule. The smell of polished wood, faint perfume, and tension that was strong enough to taste mixed with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint scratch of pens in the gallery as the bailiff adjusted his stance by the door. With just enough self-deprecation to appear reasonable and just enough performative humility to conceal the contempt that permeated every glance he stole from Maya, Nolan continued to weave his story. The city was unaware of the sluggish burn that was taking place in this room as traffic outside moved in its usual pattern of disinterested motion. Nolan leaned back in the witness chair as if he owned it, the thin smile under his mustache daring anyone to question him while the prosecutor guided him through his testimony like a dance they'd rehearsed, each step designed to paint Maya Ellis as the aggressor. He spoke about her uncooperative attitude, how she refused lawful commands, and made him fear for his safety, his voice dropping slightly on the last phrase, as though the weight of those words might earn him extra Alex. Grant sat at the defense table, tapping his pen slowly, his gaze flicking between the footage and his client, knowing the real story had been carved out and hidden like it was classified. And Maya kept her eyes forward, her face still, every muscle coiled in that military, calm that could hold through an ambush. The jury listened, some of them unconsciously nodding. The gallery shifted in its seats, and the edited body cam footage played on the monitor beside the judge. The grainy clips showed only when the prosecutor asked him to describe the defendant's behavior in detail. Nolan leaned into the microphone, his voice taking on that condescending lilt. "Ma'am, I've dealt with a lot of traffic stops in my time, but I've never had someone look me dead in the eye, refuse my orders, and posture like they were about to do something reckless." She had that defiant energy, the kind you can feel in your gut, and a low murmur. Nolan walked past the defense table during a recess, whispering, "Guess your little attitude doesn't work in here, huh?" Low enough for the bailiff to miss it, but loud enough for Maya to hear, and continued walking without waiting for a response. Alex saw a flicker in Maya's eyes, but she didn't move or respond. Discipline also meant knowing when not to act. Back in session, the prosecutor presented supplementary evidence, which consisted of a grainy still image of Maya standing next to her vehicle with her arms crossed, as if it were evidence of defiance rather than her patiently waiting for Nolan to finish going through her registration. People leaned forward when Nolan spoke, leaned back when Maya's attorney raised objections, and the gavel was tapped twice to keep tempers from rising in the room. Alex began his cross-examination slowly, laying the groundwork with neutral questions. Where Nolan was positioned, the distance between him and Maya, the lighting conditions, then asked if he'd been aware of any special circumstances about the driver that night. Nolan smirked, glancing at the jury as if letting them in on the joke. "Nothing I consider special," and the smirk deepened when Alex pressed, "You're sure? Nothing about her identity that might be relevant?" Nolan shook his head. Just another civilian with an attitude, and the choice of words hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Alex's pen hovered above his pad. He didn't look at Maya, didn't tip his hand, but the rhythm of his questions began to change, his voice sharpening as he pointed out inconsistencies between Nolan's written report and his testimony, catching small details, distances that didn't add up, commands he claimed to have given that didn't appear in the body cam audio, the absence of any mention in his original report about feeling physically threatened, until after Maya filed her complaint. The first blemish on Nolan's self-assurance was a slight shift in his seat. The jury began to look at him differently and move their pens more slowly. Maya remained still, her eyes fixed on something beyond Nolan's shoulder. On the inside, however, the weight of every covert operation she had ever led, every training hour, and every mission in which keeping quiet was essential to survival was pressing against a thin line that separated patience and disclosure. The judge overruled the prosecutor's objection to Alex's speculative line of questioning and ordered Nolan to respond with a curious tilt of her head. He did, tersely now, his earlier confidence thinning, yet still unaware that the ground beneath him was about to be pulled entirely away, that the woman he'd mocked under his breath and painted as dangerous was more dangerous than he could ever imagine, and not because of what she'd done that night, but because of everything she'd done before, the parts of her life she had allowed to stay invisible. Until now, a Nolan's heel tapped once against the base of the witness stand, the sound sharp enough for the microphone to catch as Alex Grant leaned in, his voice deceptively calm. "Officer Nolan, would you say you received advanced tactical training in your career?" "Of course," Nolan said with a slight chest puff. "Includes the badge." Alex nodded as if agreeing. So you're confident in your ability to handle a physical confrontation with an unarmed civilian? Nolan allowed a dry chuckle. Naturally. The room caught the smugness in the word. And yet, you've testified under oath that my client posed such a severe threat to you physically. You had no choice but to escalate. Alex asked after pacing one slowly, like a man circling a truth. That's correct, said Nolan, who shifted but kept his jaw locked. Alex's tone stayed neutral, almost casual. Are you aware of Ms. Ellis's prior occupation? Nolan smirked at the jury. If I am, it's probably not impressive enough to mention. A couple of jurors looked up from their notes. In the gallery, someone leaned forward. Alex let the silence breathe before sliding a thick, sealed folder from his briefcase and offering it to clerk. Your Honor, he said evenly, the defense moves to enter into Evidence Defense Exhibit 12, Commander Maya Ellis's official service record. A ripple swept through the courtroom like wind over tall grass as the judge raised his eyebrows. A tiny pause appeared in Nolan's grin. Judge Hughes opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page, then the next, her expression sharpening into something the jury noticed. She began reading, United States Navy Active Service, 2002 to 2022, aloud. Multiple deployments abroad. With valor, a Bronze Star. The Silver Star Navy Cross. Commander, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, was his final rank. The room went silent, except for the soft thud of someone's pen hitting the floor. One of the jurors actually mouthed the words, Navy SEAL. Nolan blinked once, twice, his smirk gone entirely. Alex approached the stand, voice now carrying a blade's edge. So, Officer Nolan, knowing this, would you like to revise your testimony that you fear for your physical safety against an unarmed woman? Nolan stammered. That's irrelevant. Irrelevant? My client is one of the most highly trained special operations commanders this country has ever produced. Alex started off. She wouldn't have been resisting arrest if she wanted to hurt you. Rather, she would have ended the threat before you called for help. But the full unedited body cam footage, he gestured to the technician at the evidence cart, shows exactly what happened. Maya's calm voice identified herself, her hands in plain view. Nolan's mocking tone, the unnecessary shove, and the cuffs biting into her wrists were all on display as the screen came to life. Not the prosecutor's clip montage. A juror shook their head slowly as gasps came from the gallery. Alex paused the footage at the moment Nolan sneered, Commander of what, your book club? And allowed the frozen frame to float through the air. Alex quietly said, This is the man who says he feared for his life. Nolan's face had gone tight, his hand gripping the edge of the stand as though it could anchor him. You will disregard any prior characterization of the defendant's conduct that is contradicted by this footage, said Judge Hughes as she turned to the jury with her voice clipped. Then she turned back to Nolan. Officer, you may want to consider your position very carefully before you continue. The silence in the courtroom lasted just long enough for everyone to hear the thud of Nolan's confidence hitting the floor. When Judge Hughes spoke, her voice was the sound of stone breaking cleanly in two. Officer Nolan, based on this testimony, the evidence presented and the contradictions between your report and the unedited footage, this court finds your credibility severely compromised. The air in the courtroom was different now. Charged not with Nolan's swagger, but with the heavy, she turned her attention to the prosecutor, who was frozen in her seat with her lips pressed into a line, as if she had taken a bitter bite. The judge continued, each word deliberate. The charges against Commander Ellis are dismissed, effective immediately, and I am ordering a transcript of the proceedings to be forwarded to Internal Affairs for review for possible perjury. Like leaves being blown by wind, the gallery was filled with a collective exhale. Maya didn't smile because her face was the same as it had been from the beginning, but her eyes softened like a soldier would when the end of mission was finally in sight. Nolan, on the other hand, looked like a man trying to find a door to a room with none, his shoulders caving in, his gaze darting to the jurors who now studied him with cool detachment. The bailiff instructed him to step down, and for the first time all morning, his stride wasn't confident. It was cautious, as though the floor itself might give way. Reporters were already making their way out into the hallway to file their stories as Judge Hughes rose and disqualified the jury. You could have told me you were DevGru on day one. Alex whispered softly to Maya as he leaned in toward her. She gave him a small, knowing look. And did you notice his expression? There's no way. They stood, Maya sliding her chair back with measured grace, gathering her bag as the first journalist pushed microphones toward her. For the first time since the trial began, she stopped just outside the defense table and spoke directly to the room. I didn't fight for my country to come home and have to fight for my character, she said, her voice calm but carrying. But if I have to, I will. The truth matters, no matter what uniform you're wearing. Cameras clicked like a swarm of locusts as she turned away, heading for the tall double doors. In the corridor, sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, painting the tile floor in warm squares. After a few minutes, Nolan appeared, moving quickly with his head down, and the other officers, who had previously laughed with him, avoided looking at him. One said something to the other, and the two of them left without looking back. Across the hall, an internal affairs investigator in a gray suit was already waiting with a notepad. The courthouse steps outside were crowded with reporters and observers. Alex was by her side as Maya steadily descended, and the reporters yelled, "How did she feel? Would she file a complaint? Did she think Nolan should lose his badge?" She stopped halfway down, raised a hand for quiet. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about accountability. Officers should be held to the same high standards as soldiers on the battlefield." A young black woman in a navy ROTC sweatshirt somewhere in the back clapped once loudly, and others joined in. The crowd murmured approval. At the base of the steps, a law student who'd been in the gallery approached, clutching a battered notebook. "Commander Ellis," she said, her voice trembling with nerves, "thank you for your service and for today." Maya studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're welcome. Also, keep in mind that no one can write your story for you." She moved on, disappearing into the sunlight, leaving the cameras scrambling to catch her retreating figure. That evening, the news cycle exploded with the story. Television screens flashed a headline, "Charges dropped against decorated Navy SEAL commander," and commentators analyzed Nolan's smirk and dismiss a book club line as the service record was read aloud. On social media, veterans weighed in, some sharing their own stories of being doubted, others demanding reforms in policing and courtroom conduct. Maya was sitting on her couch in sweatpants in a quiet apartment across town with a cup of tea cooling on the coffee table. Her phone buzzed with messages of thanks from old teammates, family, and strangers. She read a few, set the phone down, and stared out the window at the city lights. There was no fist-pumping victory, no swelling music, just a steady hum of traffic and the knowledge that, for now, she had her name back. Nolan sat on a bench a few miles away in a precinct locker room and stared inside his locker. His nameplate above the door looked suddenly temporary. On the bench beside him was a folded letter from Internal Affairs, sealed but heavy in his hand. He didn't open it. Days later, Maya visited a local high school to speak to the Ndrak unit. She told them about discipline, about service, about keeping your integrity even when it costs you something. She didn't mention the trial, but one cadet, sharp-eyed, maybe 16, asked, "Ma'am, what do you do when someone lies about you?" After a brief pause, Maya offered a straightforward response. "You ensure that the truth has a voice, and you keep speaking until it is louder than the lie." The room was silent for a beat, then the cadets nodded one by one. When she left, the sun was setting, the sky streaked in gold and crimson. She walked her car with the same steady stride she'd used to walk out of the courtroom, the same stride she'd used on countless tarmacs around the world. For all the uniforms she'd worn, for all the battles she'd fought, Maya Ellis knew this one thing. Dignity wasn't given in medals or verdicts. It was claimed, held, and carried every day, no matter who tried to take it. And as she drove away, the city lights flickering on in her rear view, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the kind a warrior wears when a mission is done and the ground under her feet is solid again. Sun carved bright ladders to the courthouse windows, gilding oak benches and the brass lip of the double doors as Maya Ellis sat at the defense table with her hands folded and her back straight, still as a drawn bow. Across the aisle, Officer Brad Nolan lounged his press blues like a man who'd already won. trading smirks with colleagues and letting his medals do the whispering while the prosecutor shuffled edited body cam clips that made defiance out of patience. And when the bailiff called "All rise," Judge Caroline Hughes swept in, her gaze taking to measure the room the way a lighthouse takes to measure the sea. State versus Maya Ellis, the clerk read, and Nolan was on his feet, oath sworn, voice smooth as a sales pitch. Failure to signal, aggressive demeanor, non-compliance, officer safety. Each phrase a polished stone he tossed at the jury with practiced ease. And every so often he cut a look at Maya like he could shrink her from across the room. She kept, breathing in that calm, square rhythm they taught her long before courtrooms, eyes forward, jaw soft, remembering his midnight smirk at the roadside and the shove that followed her simple question, "Am I being detained?" Her attorney, Alex Grant, tapped his pen, waited, stood, and cross-examined like a man laying breadcrumbs out of dark wood. Distances that didn't add up, commands Nolan swore he gave that never surfaced on audio, a miraculous new fear for life, that only appeared after Maya filed complaint. "Nothing about the driver struck you as special?" Alex asked mildly, and Nolan half laughed into the mic. "Just another civilian with an attitude," a line that hummed in the air like a live wire as the gallery shifted in a low, satisfied murmur. The judge let the corner of one eyebrow rise, continue, and Alex did, sliding a sealed folder to the clerk with the delicate finality of a detonator. "Defense Exhibit 12, he said, and when Judge Hughes opened it, the room leaned as one body. She read, voice even but edged, "United States Navy 2002, 2022, with valor, a bronze star, silver star. The Navy Cross final rank, Commander, Naval Special Warfare Development Group," Alex said, and somewhere a pen clattered a tile while Nolan's mouth forgot where to rest. When he pointed at the screen, Alex didn't raise his voice. Rather, he made the truth louder. The uncut body cam showed Maya with her hands high and steady, her voice calm, Nolan's mockery, the pointless shove and the cuffs biting skin. The camera stopped exactly on as the judge turned to the jury with a precise instruction about disregarding contradiction that sounded, in the bones, like thunder. The silence that followed was the kind that makes room for a verdict. When it broke, it was Judge Hughes' gavel, clean as a snapped branch. "Charges dismissed." Alex said softly, "This is the man who says he feared for his life." Transcript to Internal Affairs, a review of possible perjury. And Nolan stepped down like the floor might tilt, swagger folding into something small as his colleagues found fascinating new places to look. In the hallway, sunlight pooled on tile, while microphones sprouted like grass. "Commander Ellis, how do you feel?" And Maya stopped half a stare down and gave him the only doctrine she cared to repeat. "I didn't fight for my country, to come home and fight for my character, but if I have to, I will." That night, city lights flashed outside her window, while her phone buzzed with teammates, strangers, and family. She let the tea cool because some victories don't need heat. They just need quiet, just the weight of your name returning to your hands. Somewhere across town, in a locker room that smelled of metal and soap, Nolan turned a sealed envelope in his palm and stared at a nameplate that suddenly appeared to be temporary. The truth doesn't depend on the uniform days. Later at Indrak, a cadet with sharp eyes asked, "Ma'am, what do you do when someone lies about you?" And Maya said, "You make sure the truth has a voice, and you keep speaking until it's louder than the lie." And the nods in that room felt like a tide turning. When she left at sunset, sky cut with gold and crimson, she walked with the same steady stride she'd use on tarmacs, and into court and back out again, the stride of someone who knows dignity is not awarded but carried. And if you wanted a neat epilogue, it came on the courthouse steps where a young black woman in a Navy ROTC sweatshirt clapped once hard, and others followed, and on a news crawl that finally got a story right, and in the precinct where silence around one man grew heavy, and in Judge Hughes' chamber where a copy of Exhibit 12 sat on credenza like a small, polite thunderbolt, and in Maya's rear-view mirror as the city stitched itself back together behind her, roads and windows and people who would never know her name but would walk a little safer because someone refused to let a lie win. She smiled small and private, the way warriors do when a mission ends without fanfare, and said to the empty car what she had always known, "We hold the line, even when no one's watching," then turned the radio up just enough to feel the bass in her ribs and let the night take her home.